The American Civil War was the deadliest war that has ever occurred on American soil. The war was fought between the Confederacy in the South and the Union in the North, both of which were strongly determined that they were fighting for the right cause. But what was it that caused this deadly civil war? How did the Civil War play out? What were the two sides' relative strength, and what consequences followed? There were several reasons that the Civil War occurred, and I will go through and explain the three main reasons. Slavery was widely spread in the United States in the mid-19th century, especially in the southern states, with the most influential slave states being Florida, Texas, Virginia, and South Carolina. While the northern states were heavily industrialized, at least in comparison to the South, the southern states were mostly agricultural. The South had huge plantations, where they cultivated mostly tobacco and cotton, especially cotton. They had white plantation owners, and used black slaves imported mostly from Africa. The slaves were owned by the plantation owners, and they were only given according to their needs. The slaves had no freedom, rights, or citizenship, so they could not do anything whatsoever. The main discussion when it came to slavery wasn't whether the southern states had to abolish slavery or not, but whether the slavery should be allowed to spread to other American states. The United States was at the time waging war against Native Americans, conquering new territory and expanding rapidly towards the west. Those who wanted to keep slavery believed that if slavery wasn't allowed to spread, it would be the same as abolishing it long term. Thus, it brewed up to conflict. The second subject of dispute was the conflict about whether states should be allowed to decide more for themselves. In this period, the conflict was mostly based around whether the federal government should be allowed to regulate or even abolish slavery within an individual state. The southern states also believed that it was unfair that the northern states had way more representatives than them in the Congress. Because of this fact, they began to fear that the northern states' representatives would eventually manage to abolish the slavery. When the Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected as the next United States President in 1860, South Carolina decided to secede from the Union. In January 1961, they were followed by Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. In February, each of the 7 states sent representatives to Montgomery in Alabama and created the CSA, the Confederate States of America. When Lincoln took office as president in March, he stated that no state could secede from the Union. Shortly after, the Civil War began when Confederate forces bombarded and conquered Fort Sumter and Charleston. In the outbreak of the Civil War, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia decided to join the CSA. The Union had a population of around 21 million people. The CSA had 5.5 million free people and 3.5 million slaves. There were 118,000 total industrial companies in the United States before the outbreak of the war. 100,000 of them were in the North and only 18,000 of them in the South. In addition, 70% of the railroad network was in the North. The Union also had nearly all the arms production and double the amount of armed military than the CSA. The only advantages the CSA had over the Union was that they had better trained officers and a better structured military leadership. In the beginning of the war, both sides relied purely on volunteers, but eventually both sides passed mandatory conscription in the army for the men. The Union military strategy was formed by General Winfield Scott. It was called the Anaconda Plan, and consisted of sending the Navy to blockade all important ports in the South. In addition, they were going to commit a considerable amount of forces to conquer the Mississippi River in the west to cut the CSA in half. The Confederate strategy was to concentrate many forces in the east to conquer Washington, D.C., and launch small continuous attacks on important northern infrastructure. The Anaconda Plan worked, despite Confederate attempts to build armored ships and blockade runners, resulting in the Confederate economy suffering from inflation. In the Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched attacks in Virginia, moving closer to Gettysburg and eventually being able to attack Washington, D.C. He was, however, stalled in 1963 because he suffered defeat in the Battle of Gettysburg, which I will come back to. In the Western Theater, The Union Army under command of Ulysses S. Grant managed to push the Confederate forces to retreat down the Mississippi River, eventually defeating them in the Battle of Vicksburg. This was a huge victory for the Union, because it finally allowed them to take full control of the Mississippi River, thus effectively cutting the CSA in half. The Battle of Gettysburg is considered by many to be the turning point of the war. The Confederate Army would have an almost clear path to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. if they won. The battle lasted for 3 days, starting with the Confederates pushing the Union into Gettysburg, and ended when the Union managed to stop the final Confederate assault, famously called Pickett's Charge. There were 65,000 casualties, with 50,000 of them being deaths and 15,000 wounded. The battle resulted in a victory for the Union and forced the Confederates on the defensive. The CSA finally gave up in April 1865 after being surrounded on multiple fronts. The Civil War had at that time cost more than 600,000 lives. On the 14th of April, Abraham Lincoln was murdered. He is not only known for being president, but also for the Emancipation Declaration, which he issued in 1862, freeing all slaves in Confederate territory. The American Civil War was a milestone in the development of a more modern warfare, with the development of new arms and techniques. It also resulted in the 13th Amendment being added to the American Constitution, meaning that all the 4 million slaves in America at the time were set free. But although the slaves were set free, they were not equal in law with the whites, and racism and discrimination of blacks is still apparent in the United States today. The Ku Klux Klan was created in the South after the war, believing in white supremacy, and it was formed by Southern veterans. The Civil War also led to increased industrialization of the country and made the United States become a world superpower. It is also said that the Civil War was a war about states' rights and federalism, where the Union represented federalism and the CSA representing states' rights. As such, the victor was the power of the national government. Thank you for your attention. I hope that you learned something new. Goodbye.